There are a ton of things that you can do without the help of a doctor, right? The foundations, like if that's the icing on the cake, is all of the functional medicine intervention. The foundations are really come back to diet, exercise, sleep, stress management.
So Heather, it's so great to have you on the Doctor's Pharmacy podcast. I've been following your work for a long time. I'm very inspired to see how you're addressing this epidemic of dementia and Alzheimer's in a totally new way that we're going to dive into today. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here.
So before we kind of dive into the meat, or maybe the vegetables, or maybe the fat, I don't know exactly what, I want to kind of give people a little bit of a background on where we are in the world of dementia. And given how advanced medicine is, how much we've learned about addressing things like diabetes and heart disease and cancer, we've really missed the boat on dementia. And we really have failed to stem the tide, which is growing dramatically. In 2024, I think there's 6.9 million Americans who are 65 and older living with Alzheimer's. The number is projected to go up to 8.5 by 2030, and I think 14 million by 2050. Across the world, it's also a problem. There's 55 million people living with it now, and this will go to 82 million by 2030 and even more. And the cost is just staggering. I mean, I think the direct and indirect costs makes this the most expensive health condition out there. The direct and indirect costs in 2024 were $360 billion, $1 billion a day. And there's also a lot of, unpaid costs that are given by family members and so forth. So it's by 2050, the cost will be about $1 trillion. That's, right now that's about $1 in $16 of our economy. So it's a problem. And globally, the costs are now 1.3 trillion as of 2019 and 2.8 trillion by 2030. And yet we're kind of miserably failing. And it's not for lack of trying. And I think what we're going to talk about today is we've been misguided in how we've been investigating this problem. We've been misguided in where to look and what to do. We've been chasing down the wrong alley for the answers. And we're really not much closer than we were a few decades ago, in my view. There's enormous amount of research. It's not like there's a lack of research. I think since the early 2000s, there's been about 292 interventional trials funded by the National Institute on Aging. In 2024, there's 171 studies ongoing and 134 drugs for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And yet none of them work. And we're spending about $3.5 billion per year doing this research, and we're getting no return on investment. Really, I think the failure rate is over 99% for drug candidates. And the drugs that get approved are basically marginally effective, and they're considered a success if they slightly slow the progression. No reversal, just slightly slow the progression. So with that context, I kind of want to say something really radical, which is that there are people out there like you and like others, like Dale Bredesen, and in my practice as well, where we're seeing people actually reverse dementia, not just slow it down, not just kind of delay the entry to a nursing home by a few months, but to literally stop it and turn back the clock and bring people's memories back. Not always, not in every case, not 100%, but some are. And if that's the case, then we should be deeply looking at the data around this. Now, one of the good things is that you're thinking about this differently. And I think the issue has really been a thinking problem. We've been thinking we're going to find the single drug, the single pathway, the miracle cure for dementia. We just are not going to find it because it's a very complex problem. That's not one disease. It's many, many different kinds of things that go into causing someone's brain to dysfunction. And the common symptom is dementia. Just like pain can be the common symptom of everything from cancer to dehydration to banging your head to a million different reasons you can get pain. The same thing with dementia. It's just a symptom. And the question is, what's the cause? So with that in mind, I kind of love you to talk about how you came to kind of a different way of thinking about Alzheimer's and what you talked about in your book, which was really a radical idea, which is called Reversing Alzheimer's, the new toolkit to improve cognition and protect brain health. Now, that title alone should make people stop. Like, it's one thing to reverse diabetes, although some doctors still don't think you can do that. But reversing dementia, pretty much nobody in their right mind would even hazard to say that, because it sounds like it's giving people false hope, and maybe it's just snake oil. And why should we kind of be paying attention to that when we should be actually doing the real research on what's going on? So I'm kind of excited to talk to you about this whole idea of reversing dementia. So tell us sort of, how did you first come upon this, and how did you first sort of understand that our thinking was wrong and that we needed to kind of refocus how we were doing things around both diagnosis and treatment for dementia?
I came to this as a skeptic. I had heard, like most clinicians, I was trained that there was nothing you could do. And as you mentioned, to suggest there was something we could do for someone struggling with cognitive decline on their way towards Alzheimer's, it would be to give them false hope. And through my work, after being trained by Dr. Dale Bredesen, I saw what was possible. My patients proved to me that, in fact, you could reverse this disease process. You could reverse the symptoms associated with Alzheimer's. And my mind has changed. I think that there's actually a lot of hope, and the false hopelessness that comes with being told there's nothing that you can do for Alzheimer's actually is, I think at this stage, criminal, right? We're told, yeah. I still have patients showing up in my office saying, I saw the neurologist, very well informed, great guy, but he told me there's nothing I can do. I need to get my affairs in order. They're going to take my driver's license away. And there's a couple medications. Yeah. They don't work very well, but I can come back in 6 or 12 months and they'll measure the decline. And this is really unfortunate, because there's a lot of great research showing us that there is a multitude of things that we can do to support not only cognitive health, but neuronal health, the cellular health of our brain.
Yeah, that's quite an amazing statement, is that you're seeing actually people reverse this. And you mentioned a guy named Dale Bredesen, who's a friend and colleague of mine. And actually his wife was a functional medicine doctor, and he was a trained traditional Alzheimer's dementia researcher. And she kept pushing him to kind of learn more. And she gave him a book that I wrote, I think in 2009, called The Ultra Mind Solution, where I detailed how our bodies and our biology impact our brain function, everything from autism to Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. And I shared a number of cases that I had of reversing Alzheimer's. And I think it got him very interested, because he saw that what I was observing in the clinic were the same things that he was observing in his research lab, that he then saw a connection with. And that realized there may be a clinical pathway, not just a research in a lab with mice, but actually a clinical approach that really helps to address the root causes and to give people a chance of actually getting their brains healed. And that's kind of how he started his whole journey. And now he's been doing this for decades, and you learn from him, and it sort of makes me really happy. I remember, a number of cases I had. I'm just going to share a few cases that give people some context here. And then I'd love to hear some of your cases, and then talk a little bit more about what actually the meat of this is. But, I had a number of cases that I had over my career. One was a woman who was probably like early 80s. And she was a very smart woman who'd been the chairman of many boards and was very active in her community. And her doctors told her she had early dementia and to get her affairs in order, just exactly you told her. And I just like you said, right? I mean, the joke about neurologists is they're basically say diagnose and adios. Basically, here's the diagnosis. There's nothing I can do. See you later. And unfortunately, that's just sad, because there's so much that can be done. And this woman, she was really declining. And I did what I usually do, which is ask a lot of questions. And I did a bunch of diagnostic tests. And I found out actually she was very impaired in her ability to what we call methylate, which is to convert the folate and the B vitamins from your diet into the right ones. And she was also very nutritionally deficient in B12, because as you get older, you don't absorb it as well. And so I gave her B12 shots, and I gave her a high dose of methylating B vitamins, folate, B6, B12. And literally, like, her memory came back like that. And that was a very quick, easy one. Not all of them were like that, but it was pretty dramatic. And about maybe 6 or 7 years later, she called me, and I thought, oh, maybe she's declining and there's something wrong and she's going to need more help. She goes, well, Dr. Hyman, I'm going trekking in Bhutan, and I want to know what I should do to prepare myself. I'm like, great. So there was that story. And I had another guy who was a 7-year-old guy who owned his own company, and it was quite a large company, and was the CEO, and just couldn't function anymore. It was very impaired, had severe memory loss, severe depression. His family couldn't manage him, and his wife brought him in kind of with the last legs, kind of hopeful that something could be done. And I said, look, I don't really know, but I'm just going to apply the principles of looking at all the variables that could affect the brain function and correct them. And maybe it'll work and maybe it won't, but let's try it. And we found a whole bunch of things that we now know are at the root cause of dementia. We found he had significant insulin resistance. He had severe prediabetes. He had severe gut issues and what we call bacterial overgrowth, and that bacteria was affecting his brain. He had also very high levels of mercury, extremely high. Like on a challenge test, you'll understand this, but his mercury was 350 after giving a DMSA challenge test. It was actually DMPS at the time. And, normally it should be less than 3. Over 20 is bad, and his was 350. And he also had really impaired methylation, had high homocysteine. He also had the genes. He had the ApoE44, which is the Alzheimer's gene. He had the Alzheimer's risk gene. He had also impaired methylation genes, glutathione genes. So we had a whole bunch of stuff that we corrected. And we got rid of the metals. We fixed his gut. We optimized his diet, fixed his insulin resistance, optimized his nutrients. And he ended up reversing his cognitive loss and was able to go back to work and be a functioning member of his family again. And, at the time it was a miracle for me because I was like, wow, this is quite amazing. And it kind of made me realize that we're not telling the whole story here. We're missing the boat. So can you talk a little bit about the approach that you take? And you've done a bunch of research. You published a paper that I think we'll talk about a little bit called, Observed Improvement in Cognition During Personalized Lifestyle Intervention in People with Cognitive Decline, basically taking people who are already mentally impaired, cognitively impaired, and putting them on a multimodal intervention to address all the causes and variables that you found. And it's very personalized. It's not, here's the treatment for Alzheimer's. It's very personalized. So can you share a little bit about the approach in general? How do you think about dementia differently than other practitioners? How do you think about the diagnosis of what the root causes are? And let's start there, and then let's sort of go into some of the treatment modalities.
Yeah, I think it helps to start with this conventional model, right? What are we comparing it to? So the conventional model and the incentive structure of sort of the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, the way that healthcare is set up is that what we want to find is a single molecule intervention, right? That can be patented, that is very simple to dispense from a pharmacy, that there's simple instructions. Just take this one pill once a day and you'll feel better. And that works if you've got a UTI, right? And we can get a cure, and that can be in the past, take antibiotics for 7 days, don't have to think about it again, hopefully. Now, when we're talking about Alzheimer's, this is very complex. And our friend Daniel Schmattenberger, he really taught me to think. And I feel very privileged to have spent a lot of time discussing. We would meet every Tuesday afternoon for 4, 5, 6 hours on these marathons, just kind of reprogramming my brain about how to think through diagnosis of complex disease. And put simply, when you think of any complex system, whether it's a houseplant or a financial system or government systems or the brain, what you're looking for is balance, right? An imbalance is going to create dysfunction in that complex system. And so imbalance is going to be too much or too little or at the wrong time or in the wrong place. And when we think of the brain, this leads to disease when we have imbalance, especially over time. And so we can say, okay, imbalance, this is helpful, we'll simplify, and then we want to systematize imbalance of what? What are the causal level factors? And I would argue that there's 6 of them. It's toxins, so imbalances of toxins in the wrong place, at the wrong time, too much, too little. Nutrients, right? You mentioned insulin resistance and blood sugar becoming so high that it becomes toxic. That can be a problem. But also you mentioned B12 and having too little B12 associated with genetics. And maybe for your neighbor, they need more B12 than you do. So we have these individualized needs and requirements where we want to get that functional requirement met, not just the RDA, not just that recommended daily allowance. So we have toxins, nutrients, stressors. We can have too much or too little stress, right? Some people want to kick their feet up and just relax in retirement, but they're not getting that engagement. And then we also know on the flip side that caregivers, care partners for people with Alzheimer's are at higher risk of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's themselves later on because they have too much stress. Cortisol becomes literally toxic to the hippocampus, those memory centers of the brain. So toxins, nutrients, stressors, structure. You mentioned getting hit over the head and causing pain. Well, that can also cause inflammation in the brain and be a traumatic brain injury that can put us at risk. You mentioned ApoE4. We can have molecular structure, genetic structure that puts us at risk for developing Alzheimer's later on. So again, toxins, nutrients, stressors, structure, infections. We know there are a handful of infections that are directly associated with the triggering of amyloid plaque production. So things like P. gingivalis, which causes gingivitis in the mouth. Also, the Lyme spirochete has been found in amyloid plaques, as well as H. pylori is associated, and herpes. The herpes simplex 1 virus is another one. The gut-brain connection and infections in the gut can lead to imbalances in neurotransmitters, and there's many other. I mean, in fact, I have a reverence for how complex the gut-brain connection is, and wouldn't pretend to understand it fully. But we know that there's a lot of back and forth communication between the gut and the brain, and the microbes specifically in the gut have a lot to do with that. So again, toxins, nutrients, stressors, structure, infections can lead to dementia. And then signaling. Are we getting the signals? Dr. Bredesen has this phenomenal, I love this analogy of brain health, thinking of your brain like a country, my brainistan. If we are stuck in that fight and defend mode, if we're being invaded by infections, or if we need to defend against toxins like heavy metals you mentioned, or mold toxicity or chemical toxicity, then we're using our resource to take care of that attack and defend. We're not able to use that resource to build the infrastructure, right? To build new neurons and new connections between those neurons, the way a country might build roads and schools. We want to use those nutrients to fully resolve those issues that we're attacking and defending against. And it makes sense that if we're trying to do both, we're not going to be very good at doing either, right? We're not going to fully resolve the infections or fully resolve the toxic burden. And we're also not going to be that great at having functional neurons to help remember our neighbor's name or remember where we put our phone or our keys. So what we want to do is think really holistically about this. You mentioned, there's multiple factors that go into brain health. And this is what I would think of as a comprehensive list, although I'm sure we will continue to know more. But it's a much more comprehensive way to approach each individual and what's causing them to go down this path towards this common diagnosis of Alzheimer's or memory loss associated with age.
Yeah, it's something I see a lot of. It's just, we get in this reductionist model where we're looking for the single drug for the single disease, like you talked about, and it's why we spent billions and billions of dollars and hundreds of studies with zero real benefit. And I think, what you're speaking to is that this is a complex set of diseases, not just one disease, even if it's called Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. They're really complex and have multiple causes. Not everybody who has that has the same causes. They might overlap, but it's really important to look at what's going on for that individual. Like that one patient I said, she had vitamin deficiencies. Another guy, he had a whole host of things like mercury. So you have to find out what the treatment is for that person, not a kind of one size fits all. And it's just the antithesis of how we do research. And I think what you're talking about also, there's insults that happen, basically in the way I think about it is too much bad stuff, not enough good stuff. And I think you're talking about we're missing the things that we need to make our brains work well. And we're having too much of the stuff, whether it's infections or microbiome or toxins or sugar or stress that actually cause damage to our body. So when you start to think about someone like this, you're thinking about a lot of these factors that have modifiable solutions, right? It's not like, oh, well, if you have a toxin, there's nothing you can do about it. Oh, if you have insulin resistance, there's nothing you can do about it. Oh, if you're nutritionally deficient, there's nothing you can do about it. They're all treatable, right? And so that's the beauty of this whole approach of functional medicine and this approach to dementia is that it really helps you to navigate a very complex set of variables and kind of understand how to start assessing them and actually treating them. So when you start to do assessment, one of the things I love that Dale talked about was this whole idea of dementogens, and I wondered if you could kind of go through what you kind of did a little bit, but I think it's sort of worth, going through what the kind of framework is of these dementogens that he talks about and how those can impact us and what we call the exposome, which are the hidden things that tend to cause brain dysfunction.
Yeah. So when I work with a functional medicine patient, there are all these medical pieces that I almost think of as icing on the cake. So I definitely want to go in this direction and support people in knowing how to communicate with their doctor and knowing what to ask for and what kind of testing. And certainly there are a ton of modifiable things that we can address. And I also want to just take this step back to say, there are a ton of things that you can do without the help of a doctor, right? The foundations, like if that's the icing on the cake, is all of the functional medicine intervention. The foundations are really come back to diet, exercise, sleep, stress management. And so I of course want to, because we're both functional medicine practitioners, I want to dive into that deeply. And I wish that the whole medical system was coming in that direction. But I also don't want to miss the opportunity to tell people, if you don't have access to that, if cost is an issue, there are many, many, many things that have an outsized impact that really come back to, what are the things I put in my mouth every day? What do I eat? What do I consume? What are the nature of my relationships and my stress levels? What time do I get to bed each night? How much movement do I get each day? Those are the things that really impact health over time. Now, these hidden causes, these hidden things, this exposome, these dementigens, toxins are a big part of that. And I think of three flavors. There's chemical toxicity, which is ubiquitous. None of us are going to be able to avoid it all, but there are great strategies for avoiding the things that we have control over. You talked about modifiable risk factors and not modifiable risk factors. And just to give people kind of a sense of what the difference is there, we can't change the year you were born, right? We can't change your chronological age. That as that increases, our risk of dementia goes up. We can't change that you're born male or female. And if females have higher risk of dementia, they're 2/3 of dementia or Alzheimer's patients. And we also can't change your genetics, your ApoE status. This is set. But what can we change? We can change our toxic exposures. We can increase our ability to detoxify, whether it's one of these three flavors: heavy metals, mycotoxins or mold-associated toxins associated with water damaged buildings, which I see many elderly folks who have been in their houses for a long time.
Huge issue.
Really big, kind of underrepresented issue. And my other mentor is Dr. Neil Nathan, who I'm sure you've come across.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I feel really grateful to have learned from him how to support very sensitive patients and also to just be hypervigilant about that potential mold exposure. And then these chemical toxins that I mentioned. So metals, molds, and chemicals. And although we can't completely avoid all of them, what we can do is we can measure how much we're being exposed to and see if there is some detective work that can go into lowering our exposure to phthalates or petrochemicals or Roundup. Glyphosate is a big one that directly impacts the nervous system. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Stephanie Seneff. She was at MIT and has done extensive research on how glyphosate impacts the nervous system. And so understanding...
Yeah, she's been on the podcast. We'll link to that in the show notes, but yeah.
Yeah, she's fantastic. And understanding what's coming into my system, and then can my genetics tolerate those toxins? And how can I increase my ability to get rid of toxins through my liver, through my bowels, through my kidneys, through skin and lymph, maybe even through breath work, through the lungs, so that we can optimize for cellular health.
Yeah, this toxin thing is big. There's other things we're going to point to that are modifiable, like diet, like your microbiome, like infections. There's things that actually can be modifiable, but the toxin one is huge. And I think like the case I mentioned, it's one of those things that's, if you look at the scientific literature, there's ample evidence that toxins are linked to dementia. But on a clinical level, nobody's really looking at this from a traditional medicine perspective. When you go to see a neurologist, they don't measure toxin levels. They don't ask you about them. They don't ask you about exposures. They don't do any testing about it. And, one of the challenges is that it's very hard to test for some of these compounds. Mold, there was a great lab for mycotoxins that was run out of business because insurance companies didn't like it because they were getting actually, I think I was the cause of it, actually. I think it was like 20 years ago. But I had a patient who was in a house that was affected by mold. She had chronic fatigue. Her daughter had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and they lived in different bedrooms. And I had them go assess what was going on in their house and what was growing in each room. And they were different molds. And then when we did lab work with Dr. Bajani's lab, it was called Immunosciences, that did these mold toxin lab assessments. It matched exactly, like the mycotoxin antibodies were the mycotoxins that were in the room. And then she got $1 million settlement. And then the insurance company in California came and shut down, through the government, shut down the lab. It's pretty bad. But anyway, that aside, it's sometimes hard to test for these things. Heavy metals are easier to test for. You can look at blood testing. That's helpful. There's challenge testing where you can take a chelator and collect your urine. But the other toxins, which are ubiquitous, like phthalates, BPA, glyphosate, PCBs, pesticides, plastics, microplastics, they're very hard to assess. And I recently learned about how to assess them in a different way. I want to tell you about it in a minute, but I'd love to hear how you think about those, and rather than just your general, like try to reduce your exposures and improve your own body's detoxification system, which is sound advice. What are the other ways that you kind of assess these?
Yeah, so we do tests through Real-Time Labs, has an environmental pollutant panel. And so I do look at urine levels of excretion. And what I've seen is many of the sickest people, they actually don't collect much in their urine the first time. But then as we start using some binders, some glutathione, some support, some biochemical support, as we start getting them sweating, maybe get them on a detox breathwork practice, we see that those numbers will go up. And so it's almost like, again, hidden, even with our testing, some of those exposures and that total toxic burden it takes a little bit to uncover. And 3-6 months later, we see those numbers go up even when there isn't an active exposure, but it's just that they're starting to actually mobilize more of it. Also, getting on a ketogenic diet, we start to mobilize fat-soluble toxins as we are using the fats to create fuel. We can get that from adipocytes, and then we're releasing those toxins into the bloodstream, and then it's coming out in the urine a little bit more. So I think that many of these toxins, initial testing can also be deceptive, right? Most of my patients are over 65. They've had a lifetime to accumulate these things. And this can be such a scary conversation, right? It can very quickly go to like overwhelm and anxiety about how much toxicity is in the environment. We can only control what we can control. So I think testing your water or getting spring water, findaspring.com, I think is a great source to find spring water near you that hopefully isn't contaminated. I'd love your opinion on RO water. Reverse osmosis is a great way to get a lot of toxins out, but it does require remineralization because it'll take the minerals out of the water. So getting away entirely from plastic, from drinking anything out of plastic, particularly because hot plastic will leach into the water, but even just the screw cap, it's like you've got plastic sawdust in there. And so I think plastic water bottles are just toxic for so many reasons. We could talk for a weekend on all of the ways to think through toxicity.
Well, I'm going to tell you something that might blow your mind, and it's blown my mind, actually. But before I do, I just want to kind of reinforce that the approach you're talking about fundamentally is lifestyle. It's what we eat, it's how much we exercise, it's sleep, it's how we manage stress, it's some basic nutritional support. And those have a profound impact. And there are some trials that have been done, the finger trial and the pointer trial, which is underway, which are multimodal lifestyle interventions with risk factor management that have shown not just to slow dementia, but to actually reverse it, which is, again, something that all the drug studies never show, right? So it's like even the best drugs that have been approved, there's not many of them, they don't show that. And I don't know why it's not something that's headline news, because these studies are published. Your study should have been headline news. Again, it was published in the Journal of Alzheimer's. Because, if something is incurable and you actually reverse it, then don't you think we should be actually spending the billions on that rather than more drug studies?
Yes, so I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So we're going to get into all these factors that were studied in the finger trial and the pointer trial and your data as well. But I just kind of want to get back to the toxin conversation for a minute. Because, I've personally had mercury poisoning and I know what it does to my brain. It was bad. I've also had mold toxicity, so I know what that does to my brain. It made me very demented, and I had terrible memory issues and cognition issues, and I've figured out how to treat that, thank God. But I recently have been using a test out of Germany. It's a relatively new test that measures not just the stuff that comes out in your urine, that's in your blood, which is, by the way, these toxins that you're talking about are stored in fat. And so if you look at what's in your blood or what's cleared in your urine, they're not going to be there. Like they're just not, that's not what they're, it's like looking, I don't know. It's like, looking in your urine for red blood cells. They're not supposed to be there. So they're just not going to be there. And this test that they do uses an analysis of cells, not blood, but your actual cells and cell membranes, and using lymphocytes. And they find the load of toxins in there that we've never been able to see before. And it's kind of shocking to me how loaded people are and how loaded I was with everything from pesticides to phthalates to glyphosate to metals. And I've been treating myself and a bunch of others with a procedure called the PK protocol, which is designed to help replace the toxins in your cell membrane to improve cell membrane function and fluidity and cell communication and mitochondrial function, all of which are the things that go wrong when you have a neurologic disease or dementia. And so I just talked to a patient actually a couple of days ago who is a dementia patient. She's in her early 80s and very bright woman, and was starting to go downhill and was diagnosed with MCI, mild cognitive impairment, and was getting worse and worse. And I did this test on her, and I got the result, and I was sort of shocked. And it matched against what I would expect her history was. For example, she was a smoker, so there was a lot of cadmium in her cells. Cadmium is a metal that you get from smoking. She also had lindane, which is a pesticide that's been banned for years. She had glyphosate. She had all these plastics, fungal toxins that were in her cells. And what we did is a protocol that basically flushes out all that stuff using high doses of intravenous phosphatidylcholine, which is basically the fatty substance that makes up your cell membranes. And then we poured her with the glutathione and things to help detoxify, and the B vitamins we talked about, and a bunch of other minerals and support. And I talked to her on Sunday, and I was like, how's it going? She's like, I don't know. It's amazing. My memory's back. I have full short-term memory. Long-term memory is better. Someone can tell me something in the morning. I remember it the next day. She couldn't remember 5 minutes from before when she had a conversation with her husband about something, and 10 minutes later, she wouldn't remember it. And it was so exciting to me because I'm like, wow, finally we have a way to actually assess and to monitor and to treat in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before in my practice. I'm curious if you have any experience with that, what you think about it, if you know what I'm talking about. The lab is a German lab. It's called IGL.
IGL, I'm writing that down. Yeah. I'm not familiar with IGL, but I have been using the patricicaine, the phosphatidylcholine for a long time, for many years, the IVPC, and we do the exchange by IV, and then also oral PC, which we know helps with gallbladder, basically the discharge of bile, that toxic sludge that we build up. So PC, I think, also very clear that helps with the brain, as does phosphatidylserine, and choline is part of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, the most abundant neurotransmitter in the brain. But choline, we do know that choline has a big role to play in the brain. So not just the phosphatidylcholine, but choline found in eggs and in other food sources, and also in many nootropic formulas. Right.
Well, that's the major neurotransmitter that goes down is acetylcholine in Alzheimer's. So, I don't know what doses you're using, Heather, but we're using basically 20 grams, which is a lot. And over 10 weeks, we give 2 kilos basically of phosphatidylcholine intravenously.
Are you doing the in essential vials?
Yeah, but we're doing 20 of them.
20 of them. Wow. Yeah, we do 5 typically.
Yeah, I think that's way underdosing. I think because I used to do 5 and I didn't see the same results. And it's done over a period of time, but it's essentially 20 vials twice a week for 10 weeks. And if people are wanting to know how to do this, we do this at our center, an Ultra Wellness Center in Lenox, Massachusetts. I'll send Heather the protocol. So
I would love that. Yeah, because are you dripping it in D5W?
Yeah, it's dripped in, right? You're dripping it in, and then you drip in a bag of glutathione, and you have methylfolate and leucovorin and other biotin and a bunch of other stuff. So it's a pretty interesting thing. But I did my before and after testing, and it was completely different. I mean, I'll even share my results in the show notes because I think it's so compelling. And I think the before and after was just striking. And I personally felt different, dramatically different. So I think we're learning about all these things that we didn't even know before. Medicine is advancing so fast. And, unfortunately, there's not billions of dollars spent on researching IV phosphatidylcholine in dementia, but we should, because if what I'm finding is what I think is I'm finding, it's pretty exciting. And then, of course, for the mold stuff and the metal stuff, there's other things to do. The phosphatidylcholine actually also helps in the mold, but there's other things you can do for mold. But it's important to really assess whether you've got mold exposure, because it's really one of those things that can be treated. And so can heavy metals, like I shared in my case study with the patient where we did chelation on him. And other things like infections, right? I mean, Chris Christopherson had Lyme disease that caused his dementia. When he treated his Lyme disease, his dementia got better. So,
yeah, Rich Horwitz is also seeing that the treatment of Lyme disease can help with dementia. My patients, the first patient I saw who really opened my eyes to this, Darlene was her name, and she came in soon after I was trained by Dr. Bredesen in 2017. And she and her husband came in. She was entirely dependent on him. She had a MoCA score of 2. So the MoCA is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And we use this as a clinical tool to tell us where on the spectrum of cognitive decline someone is. And a perfect score is 30. It's a one-page worksheet that some of your listeners may be familiar with. You copy a cube and draw a clock, identify some zoo animals. And she had a MoCA score of 2. So she was essentially answering, she was answering questions with like yes or no, and not much more than that. Their life had been completely, changed since she had gone down very quickly with dementia and diagnosed Alzheimer's. Now, her very dedicated, loving husband had read Dr. Bredesen's book and was all in. I mean, he had, thank goodness, enough confidence for both of us, because I had never done this. And she was so severe that I wasn't hopeful at all.
Wow.
But they asked,
just to give just perspective, it's out of 30. So if your score is less than 25, it's a problem. 2 is, nobody's home.
Yeah. 26 and above is normal. Once you're down in the single digits, this is severe dementia. This is where you are dependent on others for activities of daily living. Your dignity is more or less gone, right? You're not able to do anything on your own. And so she was in that state, but she had this bright smile and her eyes would track me. And she had on this beautiful floral dress and you could just see how much soul was in her. And they just shocked me. She came back 6 weeks later and her MoCA had gone up to a 7. And of course, my initial response was like disbelief. I was like, oh my gosh, we must have done the test wrong. Like, this isn't possible. Like, what is going on here? And her husband assured me, no, she's different. Listen to her. She was speaking in complete sentences. They started bickering about something while they were in my office. And she was remembering things that he had said. And she wasn't going back to work. She wasn't 100% better. But this was the moment. I mean, I remember it like exactly what I was wearing and the way the light was shining in the room, because it was so emotional for me to be like, what? If this is possible for Darlene, like what is possible for everybody else who's not so far down along this path? There is so much suffering that we could be avoiding by taking this approach. So what did they do? They moved out of a moldy bedroom, and they didn't have to move out of their house entirely, but they moved into their living room. They started ballroom dancing 3 times a week, even though they weren't very good at it. They were going on walks every day. They got on a ketogenic diet. They ate only whole foods, got rid of all of the processed foods in their diet. She got on all the supplements that we put together based on Dr. Bredesen's approach. She got on bioidentical hormone replacement. She went and got the mercury out of her teeth, her root canals out. She got all of her dental work taken care of very quickly. And lo and behold, she improved. And I really owe so much to obviously Dr. Bredesen, but also to Darlene and her husband, because that was the moment, like I could not deny how much better she had gotten.
Yeah. What was her score after you'd done all that?
It was a 7 then, and she continued to go up a bit. I've lost touch with them. They're doing things on their own, but we worked together for a couple of years, and probably like your patients, you hear from them years later and you think, have they gone down or do they need extra help? And she'll probably be like, nope, we're doing great. They were very motivated. It was really fun.
And for people listening, I just want to point something out here. This is something that you just don't hear about, right? The reversal of dementia is just something in traditional medicine that's considered heresy. And if you talk like this, if you say what we're saying, you're thought to be a quack. And, I don't mind being a quack, actually, because, it means I'm thinking differently and I'm pushing the envelope a little bit. But I don't really care, because when I see my patients get better, that's what matters to me. And I know we can have an impact on these people. Now, not everybody's going to get better. I've had cases where I just didn't find the thing or the things to do. And there may be more of a more pathology going on that I didn't really understand or that we couldn't figure out yet. But the good news is you can start to really assess people differently. So maybe you can talk about how we start to assess someone completely in what we do in traditional medicine and how that's different with the approach that you're taking. I don't know what you call it, but I call it functional medicine.
I'm trained as a naturopathic doctor, which essentially is functional medicine. And going to Dr. Bredeson's training, I was very struck by, I have all of these tools. I learned them all in naturopathic medicine. It's just applied to dementia and the brain. And also, I wasn't stacking them. I didn't have, I think, a respect for how much synergy there is between doing these things together. And when we're looking to reverse Alzheimer's, we really do need to throw everything at it. So people will ask me, well, do you start with the gut, or do you start with detox, or do you start with infections? And I say, no, we don't. We just do all of it. We throw everything at it because we're asking for a miracle. We're asking for the reversal of this neurodegenerative process, and we need to do it yesterday. Now, if we're in prevention mode, it's a much more of a luxury, right? If you know your ApoE status, you're at risk for dementia and Alzheimer's, then start in your 20s. We know that there's basically 4 stages of Alzheimer's. There's a pre-symptomatic stage where there are changes happening in the brain. You might have amyloid plaque accumulation. There's things happening that are going in the direction of neurodegeneration, maybe inflammation. There's lots of different things that can happen in response. But that is happening before we notice that we're forgetting anything. And then you have that symptomatic phase where it might not be measurable. We call it subjective cognitive impairment, where you know that your brain isn't working the way it did 5 or 10 years ago, but we wouldn't pick up anything on a MoCA score, for example, or on other neurocognitive testing. And then we have something called mild cognitive impairment. As it progresses, we start to be able to measure that your cognition is not as good. And there's lots of different ways to do neurocognitive testing. We use the MoCA score in my office because it's quick, simple, very inexpensive. And when we did the clinical trial, we also used the Cambridge Brain Sciences battery of cognitive testing. And those matched. And so instead of charging patients a lot more and taking more of their time, we rely mostly on the MoCA these days. Mm-hmm. But that mild cognitive impairment stage, there's nothing mild about it. It's actually quite devastating. It sounds like you've experienced it once or twice.
You're not in a nursing home, but you're still not great.
Yeah, you might not be able to work anymore. You're not connecting it. You're not experiencing your relationships. I had a patient come in. I saw her for the first time this week, and she actually signed up and got my book early. So she was able to read it 6 or 8 weeks ago and started implementing a lot of the program. And this just made my day. I'm sure you've heard this story. I read your book and I'm already doing better. I want to get even better. And she had, as I was asking her, are you forgetting words? Are you having trouble with word finding or names? I used to, but I don't anymore. And her husband agreed. Yeah, in the last few weeks, she's been doing a lot better. Are you repeating words or phrases or stories? I used to, not anymore. Are you overwhelmed? So many people, one of the early signs that this is starting to take place is that they used to host Thanksgiving for their family, for 20 people. Yeah. And this year, nope, she can't do it. It's too much to take on. This woman owns a restaurant, and she had felt so overwhelmed by payroll and employees. And she said she stopped going into her restaurant because she would just cause more harm than good. Now she looks forward to going in and taking care of all the things that need to be taken care of. And this just happened over the course of about 8 weeks that her life transformed so dramatically. And so these signs, that this mild cognitive impairment, again, she was basically kind of going towards retirement, forced retirement. She wasn't already at that phase of Alzheimer's, more severe Alzheimer's, where you're dependent on others for dressing and eating and driving, of course, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think what you said earlier was so important. I want to come back to it. And it's such a great story and it's so inspiring. And the thing you said earlier was that, people say, where do I start? And typically we have a very reductionist view in medicine where we just do the one thing. And, my mentor, Sid Baker, had a rule, which is called the TAC rule or the TAC rules. The first rule is if you're standing on a TAC, it takes a lot of aspirin to make it feel better, right? If you've got mold toxicity or mercury toxicity or your gut's a mess or you're massively nutrition deficient, you can take all the Alzheimer's drugs you want. They're not going to work, right? And second is if you're standing on 2 TACs, taking one out doesn't make you 50% better, So you have to find all the factors that may be going on and address all of them. And this is what we call network medicine or systems medicine or functional medicine. It's the idea that diseases have multifactorial causes, meaning there are many causes for any single disease in any one person. So it's not just there are multiple causes in different people, but even in the same person, there may be 4 or 5 factors that are driving the disease. Like in that patient I said with insulin resistance and B vitamin deficiencies and gut issues and mercury toxicity, he had all of it, right? We can't just do one thing and hope he gets better. And so that leads to what we call multimodal interventions. And this is a really unique idea in medicine, which is that you do more than one thing, right? It's like, well, how do you sort of prevent heart disease? Well, just exercise. Well, no, you have to eat better. You have to sleep. You have to deal with stress. You can't just do one thing. It's like, oh, I'm just going to, and I had this conversation we were trying to do a dementia study when I was at Cleveland. I had a discussion with one of the head researchers there, and brilliant woman and amazing. And I said, well, we have all these things we want to do and look at, and we need to do them all at once. And she's like, no. You have to study exercise, and then we'll study diet, and then we'll study vitamin D, and then we'll study vitamin B12, and then we'll no, I mean, that's not how the body works. And it's very tough because that's how our research infrastructure is set up. But you did this study, which I'd like you to kind of unpack for us now. It was published in 2023 in the Journal of Alzheimer's or Disease. We're going to put that in the show notes, a link to it. It was called Observed Improvement in Cognition During a Personalized Lifestyle Intervention in People with Cognitive Decline. So take us through the design of that study. How many people? What were the diagnostics you did? What were the findings? And then what were the changes you made and interventions you did? And then what were the outcomes? So walk us through that.
Yeah, sure. So what we did was we recruited 25 participants to go through a 6-month intervention. And like I mentioned, we just threw everything at them. So we did all of the testing. We had them make the diet changes, the exercise changes, sleep, stress management changes, all the foundational lifestyle changes. Plus, we looked for toxins and infections, did it all. And we did bioidentical hormone replacement when appropriate, supplementation, treated their gut. We looked at anything and everything that we could, their cortisol levels, their hormone levels, their thyroid levels, anything that was there that was out of balance, we treated. And we did this aggressively. We did it quickly. And in those 6 months, 17 of the 23 participants improved their cognition. So the reason I did this trial was I had patients asking me a question I didn't know the answer to. If I do this, if I spend the money, if I make the effort to do this for my mom or dad or for myself, how likely is it to work? And I didn't know if it was going to be half the time, a quarter of the time, 80% of the time. And what we saw was that when we recruited patients with MoCA scores between 12 and 23, so again, a normal is 26 and above, perfect is 30, 12 to 23 is in that mild cognitive impairment to kind of more moderate, even going. We did include patients with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And we saw that most of the time, 74% of the time, people improved. We saw that there were statistically significant. Yeah, I mean, it blew my mind. We also saw that there were statistically significant improvements across the mean of all participants included in the MoCA, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, and as well as memory specifically and overall composite cognition on the Cambridge Brain Sciences testing. We also saw improvement.
So in English, that means based on validated metrics that are used by researchers to evaluate the success of an intervention on cognitive function, that this program that you did worked, and it worked better than most other drugs that we find, right?
Any drug. Yeah, this improved cognition measurably, statistically significantly, and on multiple, basically everything that we tested had an improvement. It was statistically significant for the MoCA memory specifically, and there was also verbal ability and focus, and those ones were improved, but not statistically significantly. And then overall composite cognition was also improved, as was quality of life and sleep. And so we saw these really dramatic, amazing improvements. Now, I want to put my study in the context of other research that's been published. So Dr. Bredesen and Kat Toops, Deb Gordon, there's a group of people that have also published a trial that's very similar. So they took a 9-month intervention. Our study was a 6-month intervention, so a quicker intervention. Yeah. They had 9 months, and they took participants with MoCA scores down to 19, and they had 25 participants. Very similar intervention. Dr. Bredesen's work applied clinically, and they saw that 84% of their participants improved. So we saw 74% with more progressed disease, right? They had worse cognition to start, and we only did 6 months of intervention. So neither of these trials were randomized controlled trials, which is sort of the gold standard in research. Both of these were feasibility trials. The question we were really asking was, with a cognitively declined population, can we do this complex intervention? Will they even be able to do it? And we saw, yes, not only can they do it, can patients do it, but they will get improvements most of the time when they do. Now, really, really exciting in the research, I'm sure you saw this, but just a few weeks ago in June of 2024, Dr. Dean Ornish published a trial that is a randomized controlled trial. And he took 49 participants through a 5-month intervention. So my study was 6 months. Dr. Bredesen's group, they did 9 months, and Dean Ornish did a 5-month intervention. And he had a control group and compared the two. And what they saw, I mean, I just got chills when I read the conclusions that they drew in this trial. It was, I mean, I just do a happy dance every time I think about it, but it was a comprehensive lifestyle changes may significantly improve cognition and function after 20 weeks in many patients with mild cognitive impairment or early dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. I mean, this did make front page news. Ashok Gupta on CNN did a docuseries related to some of these patients. And so I think the narrative finally, I mean, I just am doing a happy wiggle right now talking about it. The narrative is finally shifting.
That's so good. I want to talk to you about this actually, because I think, you're pointing to the phenomena that this can get better. The question is, what's the right approach? And, you mentioned earlier that you use ketogenic diets, which is extremely high fat diet. It's like 70 to 75% fat. I think Dr. Ornish used a very low fat diet, like vegan. 10% fat, vegan, 10% vegan. So how do you reconcile that in your mind between a diets that have been actually shown in other data to actually be effective around using ketogenic diets? And I've seen this in my own patients. When they go on a ketogenic diet, they get better, which is the opposite of a 10% low fat vegan diet. So can you kind of help us understand how to think about that?
Yeah, I'm just pinching myself that I get to have this conversation with you, because I think, the food systems and like talking about diet, this is such at the crux of what you've done and paved the way for. And it's so crucially important to this conversation around brain health is what we eat. And so what I suspect will happen, I've used the ketogenic diet in my practice. It's a plant-forward ketogenic diet, right? So it's not a bacon and cheese diet. This is a very nutrient-dense, healthy diet, but metabolically, the goal is to get into ketosis and burn fat for fuel. And oftentimes it's like the lights come on. There is clearly something that happens. And I think I, again, have a reverence for how much complexity there is in that shift in metabolism. Of course, we're getting more fuel. There's detoxification happening. There's less oxidative stress. I think there's a multitude of mechanisms at play with the ketogenic diet. But I also think that one of the big things that happens with a ketogenic diet is you get rid of processed foods that are so harmful. I think that also happens in a vegan diet if you do it right. So you can have unhealthy keto, you can have unhealthy vegan diets. But Dr. Ornish, they used a very healthy vegan diet. And I suspect that what we'll see will play out over time. And as we compare these to each other is an ancestral diet is really what's best. And what was consistent about an ancestral diet was inconsistency, right? We were in ketosis sometimes because there wasn't always carbohydrates available. And then we were vegan other times because there wasn't always meat available. There wasn't always animal protein available. And so I suspect that what's best for our brain, what's best for our body is to actually change diets. It's to not always be on the same diet, but to get the metabolic flexibility of going in and out of ketosis. And what I recommend to my patients now is if you have cognitive impairment, get on a ketogenic diet for 3 to 6 months. There are benefits, and I think there are healing benefits for the brain of being in ketosis solidly for 3 to 6 months or so. And I don't have data to back that up. It's from my I have my clinical experience and what we've seen at Marama, the residential care facility that we have where we have an immersive experience in this. So I haven't seen this published, but it's what I see playing out as best for my patients. The thing with ketosis is it's not sustainable for the rest of our lives. You're going to go to a wedding. You're going to go to Italy and want to have some pasta or some gelato. You're going to go to, you're going to go somewhere where you're going to fall out of ketosis. And so then what choices to make then? Non-processed.
Yeah.
I think the overarching message around what is a brain healthy diet is avoid processed foods, eat whole foods that are nutrient dense, organic as much as possible, and then shift your metabolism.
Yeah, because I think if you're going on a whole foods, real food, nutrient dense diet, and you're switching from a standard American processed diet, you're going to see a benefit if you go to being vegan like that. But the question is, what happens over time? How does that low fat affect your brain? How would that compare to a head-to-head comparison with a healthy ketogenic diet versus a healthy vegan diet? How do you address the other variables that he's not addressing, whether it's heavy metals or the microbiome or nutritional factors? So I think it's complex and we need to do more research. So I think it got a lot of headlines, but I am concerned about, having a low-fat vegan diet as a kind of focus for dementia, because I think it might be problematic, especially, over time, these patients become more insulin resistant.
I agree. I think that there can be benefits gained from changing your diet, and then you don't want to stick with one diet for too long. I think that, and especially vegan keto, right? To try to do both, I wouldn't suggest anyone do that because you start being too restrictive and you end up with nutrient deficiencies. We know a vegan diet, you're going to have to supplement with B12. B12, as you mentioned, talking about some of your cases, very crucially important to cognitive function. And so having a diet that restricts that is not going to work long term. And that's part of why this alternating different diets, eating seasonally, the way our ancestors would have ate, it will, I think, help us to prevent those deficiencies and get the right types of nutrients without getting the excess in terms of carbohydrates.
So, diet's key. It's foundational, right, to getting people better with brain disorders, because what you eat, it determines the function of your body and your brain. So you just got to deal with that. But there are a lot of other things that you do as well. And a lot of these multimodal finger and pointer studies and Dr. Ornish's study also do this. Exercise, stress management, sleep. Those are foundational. What I want to sort of dive into is some of the other stuff. We talked about toxins, but there's some other things that are done to sort of assess the overall function, like hormone levels, nutrient status, the microbiome. Can you talk more about some of the other things that might not be that common that people know about that you do as part of the treatment and workup?
Yeah, sleep is one of these pieces that I think is really underrepresented. And I've had 2 patients in the past 18 months or so who have come in with single-digit MoCA scores. 2 women who came in with MoCA scores of 8, who nearly doubled those MoCA scores. One went up to 13 and then to 15, and the other went up to 15 and then to 16. And both of them had undiagnosed, untreated sleep apnea. And that was a big part of our intervention. Now, we did everything else, right? We measured the toxins, we measured infections, we got them on hormone replacement, the progesterone helped them sleep, I'm sure. We did all the things, right? But I think the big shift was getting sleep. So, and it made me wonder when I saw both of those patients kind of in succession, how much Alzheimer's, how much suffering is happening because people aren't getting access to sleep studies. One of these women was actually told by the sleep technician who did her study that she didn't have sleep apnea when she came in. Oh, you're not overweight, you're not male, you're not snoring, you don't have sleep apnea. And sure enough, she had severe obstructive sleep apnea.
Wow. Wow.
And so I think many people are told that they don't have it or it's not looked into. At this stage in my career, any patient with any cognitive decline, I am testing for sleep apnea. And I'm really excited because there's new technology since COVID for doing at-home sleep studies. So it can make it less cumbersome. It's less of a chore. It's less expensive than going into an overnight sleep study. That still is the gold standard. And there are a lot of sleep disorders you can't rule out with these at-home sleep studies. But we have caught many cases of sleep apnea using these. The watch pat is the one that I use. It's a watch plus a ring.
Watch pat,
Yeah. And so we're identifying sleep apnea and able to treat it. What happens during sleep is that, of course, we get that rest, right? But we need about 7 hours minimum of sleep. Some people need more than that. And we want at least 90 minutes of REM sleep and about an hour of deep sleep minimum so that we can consolidate memories, so that we can take the bite out of stressful events that happen so our cortisol doesn't spike the next day when we remember them. It also helps us to get rid of the amyloid. Amyloid can build up after just one night of sleep deprivation. If you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, Just one night of
Jeez.
sleep deprivation. I know,
That must
right?
be messed up because I lost so many nights of sleep as a resident, intern, and medical student, and delivering babies, working the ER. I must have lost a lot of brain function.
Well, it's good you know functional medicine and you can clear that amyloid out. And I hope you're prioritizing sleep these days.
So sleep is important, and I get that. I'm interested in some of the other things besides the foundational lifestyle stuff, besides sleep and exercise and diet. What else are you doing for these people?
Yeah, so looking at infections, we are treating Lyme aggressively. We're doing prophylaxis in terms of herpes. So if somebody has herpes outbreaks, we want to get aggressive about that. There are epidemiological studies that show that that can be associated with dementia. The dental work, I recommend going to a biological dentist, making sure that I'm sure you've had patients like this with root canals that are affecting their total body, their whole body health in one way or another, creating autoimmune processes and inflammation in the brain. So getting really thorough workup of what's going on in the oral microbiome is super crucially important. And then, so from an infectious perspective, getting ahead of all of that stuff and treating it aggressively, particularly if there's that ApoE status.
The sort of realm of toxins is something that, we did talk about, but I think it's one of those factors that's important. Infections, and you just got to dig until you find what's going on. And sometimes there's layers of diagnostics. I co-founded a company called Function Health, and in that initial membership fee of $4.99, you get a whole suite of tests that your doctor typically doesn't do that play a huge role in your cognitive function. Not only do we look at your levels of inflammation, insulin resistance, metabolic health, but we look at toxin levels like mercury and lead. We look at also the nutritional status like methylmalonic acid and homocysteine, which are really critical for memory and brain, which are often not tested. We look at vitamin D, omega-3 fats, and really get a profound, deep study. We're also able to do ApoE testing, and soon we'll be adding something called AD Detect, which is from Quest. It's a newer test that's not available widely, but it looks at sort of early biological markers in your blood that can predict what's going on.
Are you looking at p-tau?
P-tau is Dr. Isaacson's doing that, and he's an incredible scientist. I've had him on the podcast. I probably have him back in his work, but he's developed another test which is different than that, but it's using p-tau, and it's a very useful biomarker because when you see people improve, it gets better. So it's like a blood test to see whether or not what you're doing is better, not just a MOCA test or what people say it's maybe a subjective or a little squishy test, but an actual blood test. So I think we're going to get more and more sophisticated about our diagnostics and assessments. I think, people are listening out there and have a loved one or have memory loss themselves. I wouldn't just take it at face value. I would say you should be aggressive about investigating other therapies and other treatments, and starting with the foundational stuff, what you eat, exercise, stress management, sleep, community, relationships, becoming active, those are things that really matter. And then there's all these other layers of nutrition and infections and toxins and the microbiome and hormones and things that we talked about earlier. But it's really all of it, right? Whether some people need more testosterone or more estrogen, some people need, to have their thyroid fixed. I mean, you can have dementia from having a low thyroid that may not be picked up. So I think there's so much happening in this world that's so exciting, and you're at the leading edge of it. I wonder if you share a little bit about your residential program, because that's a really unusual idea. And I think part of the challenge is when we're thinking of doing research on this at Cleveland Clinic, it's like I wanted to bring people in for like an immersive program to be able to understand what's going on, to learn all about it, to be able to sort of internalize what we talk. Because, in a doctor visit, basically it's hard to just sort of get everything, and people are overwhelmed and kind of get, kind of deer in the headlights sort of sometimes, but an immersive program is very different. Can you talk about it, what you've done and what you found?
Yeah, sure. So around the same time we were doing the clinical trial and getting this question, if I do this, if I put in the time and effort and money to do this, how often do people get better? We also were getting the question, hey, I know I want this. I get it intellectually. I want this for my dad, or I want this for myself, but I can't do it. It's too much. I'm overwhelmed. Or of course, the sandwich generation of people who are working full time, raising kids, and their parent is sick, has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. They want Dr. Bredesen's approach for them. They want functional medicine for them, but they can't spend it's a full-time job to provide this sort of care. And so this question was coming up, where do I send my loved one? And I looked around and there wasn't a place that was really offering an immersive experience, the organic ketogenic diet, a non-toxic living environment, social engagement, physical engagement, cognitive engagement, the management of all of the supplements and medications. All of that takes a lot of labor. It takes a lot of time and effort. And so we thought, I thought, how hard could it be to just create a residential care experience for people and offer that up? And so we went, it was kind of 9 months and all of a sudden we had done it. And then COVID started, which is a story for another day because we opened our doors March 1st of 2020. And then the world shut down about a week later. But we have had this really, I mean, I just am so grateful to the families who've trusted us to support their loved ones. And what we've seen, we opened a sister facility in Kansas. So now we have 2 locations, and the Kansas data is a lot cleaner because COVID wasn't in the mix. But the first 6 residents have lived there for over 6 months, and 5 of them improved their cognition.
Wow.
What we also see in this experience is that people get off their antihypertensives, they get off their antidepressants, they get off their diabetes medications. My favorite thing to hear from someone is, I got my mom back, right? They get to have another Christmas where their mom is able to pick out age-appropriate gifts for the grandkids, right? They get another anniversary, another summer where they can really have a quality relationship with their loved one because of what we see with being able to fully implement the program.
Now, is this a place where people go and then they leave, or go and stay?
You know, that's the goal. I think as the narrative shifts, what I'm hoping is that people will come earlier on in the disease process. So right now the answer is either, whatever serves that person. We had in this May of 2024, we had our first resident move home with a MoCA score of 30. So she came when her MoCA score was 24. She had found mold in her home. Her brain was not working the way that it had been. She was getting measurable cognitive impairment was being picked up, but it was in the earlier stages. So she decided that she was going to have her home remediated, come to Marama, move in, and then sure enough, she was 6 points higher, MoCA score of 30, when she moved out May 4th of 2024.
It's amazing.
I would love for that to be what happens. Excuse me. So what I would love is that we don't have to relegate our elders to these senior living facilities, right? They are at the height of the peak of their wisdom and experience, where they have so much to share, so much value to bring to our communities. And yet they often get relegated, siloed off in these senior living facilities. And they become a detriment, right? They become a liability to society. It costs so much to care for someone who has dementia and Alzheimer's, as you mentioned at the top of the podcast. Yeah. And if we could get them back, if they could help take care of the youngest generations, their grandkids and great grandkids, and impart that wisdom, I think that we would get so much back.
It's so powerful. It's such an incredible mission you're on. I think, anybody listening to this podcast, I hope it's hopeful. And I think in my practice, I've seen this, you've seen this, Dale's seen this, many others doing this. And of course, even in traditional medicine, we're seeing this now with the finger trial, the pointer trial, Dr. Richard Isaacson's work. It's tremendous. And I think we'll put links to all that in the show notes. And people need to understand that we are in traditional medicine, mostly in the dark ages when it comes to dementia. People are not getting the best care available. They're not getting to take advantage of some of the things we've talked about today. And that it requires a little more effort, obviously, than just kind of going to your doctor and taking a pill. But it really is worth the effort in terms of helping to slow and even reverse cognitive decline as we get older. And by the way, a lot of these things are good from a prevention point of view. If you do these decades earlier, you're not going to end up with dementia, right? So it's about getting on the track early on. Really want to thank you for your work, Heather. It's just been a pleasure to talk to you. It's been very inspiring to hear about your research, to hear about what we're seeing clinically, and to actually give people a little bit of a roadmap. And your book is out now. I encourage you to go check it out. It's called Reversing Alzheimer's, the New Toolkit to Improve Cognition and Protect Brain Health. You can get everywhere you get your books. And I think it's a great journey. You can check out Dale Bredesen's work, Richard Isaacson's work. You can check out my book that I wrote a long time ago, The Ultra Mind Solution, which I'm thinking of redoing and writing a new book on this because so much has happened in the last 15 years. And hopefully we'll see you next time on The Doctor's Pharmacy.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you loved that last video, you're going to love the next one. Check it out here.